All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe for some of you, good morning still, or even good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, which is going to be all about learning ability and why learning ability is the skill of tomorrow's labor market. Now, before we dive into that, quick introduction. My name is Charlotte. I am one of the founders of Equalture. Equalture is an HR tech company. We are based in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. And we develop game-based assessments. Assessments, but in a gamified format that are being introduced at the very start of the hiring funnel. So we really stimulate our customers to no longer let people apply through a resume and a motivation letter, but instead by playing our games in order to give you a very objective overview of the candidate's strengths and weaknesses, but also to zoom in on what's actually predictive of future work performance. Now, we're going to get to that in a second. I brought Leonie here today. Leonie, it's our, what was it, third webinar that we do together today, or second one? Thanks for joining again. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself for the people who don't know you yet?
Yeah. So hi, I'm Leonie. I'm the head of science at Equalture. So I am managing the team that's responsible for the development of the games that we're making, but also testing them and a lot of communication around the games. So how do we communicate the results to the people who play them, to the people who need to evaluate the results of them, and generally any of the science-related content that comes out of this company. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Why are we hosting this webinar today? We are not going to sell our platform. We are also not going to promote our games. But the reason why we wanted to host this webinar is because we are going to launch a new assessment on our platform, which is going to be focused on learning ability. And as we were chatting about launching this new assessment, we were thinking like, hey, would it be cool to host a webinar where we can also explain a bit more why it is so important to capture a candidate's learning ability in the application procedure, and maybe especially in the labor market of today. We are not going to zoom in on the specific game, by the way, so if you're interested in that, always feel free to reach out to us, but that's not going to be tackled in this webinar specifically. We do have a chat function. It's in the right lower corner of your screen. There's a chat function and a questions tab. So if you have any questions or just comments, feel free to leave them there. And we will try to answer them all for you. Now, a bit of an introduction. I already said it in my introduction. We are not the biggest fans of CVs, but we actually have very good reasons for that. Leonie, could you maybe walk us through what we see in this picture?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of a visualization of some findings of researchers that looked at about 100 years worth of research that was done on job performance and what kind of things are predictive of job performance, of how well people do their jobs. And yeah, they looked at hundreds of papers looking into all sorts of different ways of assessing candidates and how well that then pans out with how well they do in their jobs. And then they looked at correlations between these factors and work performance, and they found that overall work experience and education, so the things that you would traditionally look for on CVs, did very badly in terms of how predictive they really were of how well someone was going to do their job. So they have correlations of, I think, 0.10 and 0.16, while looking at behavior when assessing candidates and looking at cognitive abilities specifically had a much, much higher correlation with work performance. So there we are up to like 0.65 with correlation. So that's really, really high in statistical terms.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, could you maybe briefly in case the term is new to some people joining today, explain what cognition or cognitive abilities, what that is?
Yeah. Well, cognition is basically any mental process. It's a very broad term. So cognitive processes are things like attention or memory or reasoning, anything that requires your brain to process incoming information or to produce an action. And it really determines how quickly you can process information, how much you can process, how efficient your decision making is. So a lot of these things that, when you listen to the definition, kind of make sense that they will have something to do with how well you are going to perform at your job. So yeah, basically any mental processing.
Yeah, check. And good for everyone to know is that learning ability is also part of your cognition. So that's why I wanted to zoom in on that a little bit more. So, okay, so we tackled the part about CVs might not be the most useful tool in order to predict whether a candidate is going to perform well in your job. If you focus on cognitive abilities and behaviors instead, it will provide you with a much more reliable predictor of future work performance. And I saw your chat, Marie. We are definitely going to include the article that's focused on what we visualize here. So that's one part. We also touched upon why learning ability is so important, not only in today's labor market, but only in tomorrow's labor market. And that brings me to the second thing that I wanted to quickly touch upon with everyone who's listening today. The World Economic Forum does a lot of research into how is the labor market changing, and they publish a report every 5 years with their prediction of what the labor market is going to look like in the next 5 years, which skills you need in that labor market, etc. And what I found really interesting about the most recent one that they posted is that in the next 3 years, we are going to lose a lot of millions of jobs that we know today. And with a job, I mean one specific function. And in exchange for that, we are going to get a lot of new jobs as well, which means that if we would apply to a job opening maybe in 10 years, most of us would apply to a job that doesn't exist today. I think a good example, for example, AI was a very unknown field maybe 10, 15 years ago. And nowadays, I think it's a very popular job in a lot of tech companies. So that means that we, apart from the fact that the CV is not that predictive, it's also going to get impossible to just look at someone's previous experiences and draw conclusions from that, because there's a big chance that the specific job that you're looking for is completely new to most people that apply. Having that said, I hope this clarifies a little bit why we really promote companies to focus more on learning ability than you might be doing today. And that brings us to the fun part. Could you briefly explain, Leonie, what learning ability exactly is?
Yeah. Well, learning ability is defined by our ability to connect the right pieces of information, I would say, and then somehow store these connections in our memory. So someone learning something new needs to not only understand the new information that's provided to them, but they also need to find things they already know to connect this new information to. So maybe in terms of a very general example, if I'm learning a new language and I'm learning new vocabulary, I need to connect this new word to a word in the language that I already know. But I also need to connect it to rules of grammar that I may have already learned, because if it's a verb, for example, I'll need to change that based on the context I'm using it in. I may also connect it to more than just the word I already know, but also to other things I know about this word. So if I'm learning the word dog in a new language, I may connect it to my mental representation of a dog, or the sound of barking, maybe even a certain smell. So generally speaking, the more meaningful connections I can make between a new piece of information and any knowledge that I already have, the better I will be at learning and retaining what I've learned. So learning ability is really all about drawing the right connections between pieces of information.
Nice, thanks. Hey, and something that you see in a lot of assessments is an assessment that is specifically focused on working memory. That is also the case in our learning ability game. So I do think that for people in this webinar who are used to working with cognitive ability testing, working memory is definitely something that you've seen in the past. But I also think that working memory might be still bit of an abstract term from some people. So could you also briefly zoom in on working memory specifically?
Yeah, of course. So we already touched on cognition before. Working memory is part of our cognition. That is how learning ability strongly relates to it. You can see it as a bit of an extension of our short-term memory. So while short-term memory describes how much information we can remember over a short period of time, working memory then describes how well we can work with that information that we're keeping in our short-term memory. So basically, how well we can use the information that we're keeping in our minds at the present moment. So for example, when learning the rules to a new game, we need to remember them, but we need to apply them. So sometimes we have to maybe combine some of the rules to be able to actually play the game. And our working memory capacity and efficiency both determine how much information that we're currently holding in our short-term memory we can also use and apply for the things that we're currently doing, and how efficiently we're doing that.
Yeah, so it's not only about how much information can I just get into my mind, but also how can I actually leverage the information that is in my brain currently. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to summarize it here, but I don't have a science background, so please correct me if I'm not saying the right thing. Then it might be a bit of an obvious one, but I still want to ask that question to you. What is then the relationship between learning ability and working memory?
Yeah, here we come back, I think, to what I said before about learning ability, about how it's about drawing the right connections between the new pieces of information that you're taking in and the things that you already know. So your working memory determines how many pieces of information you can keep in mind and work with at the same time. So you can think of it as sort of a headquarters inside of your brain where all the decision making happens on where to steer your attention and what to do with the information that's coming in. So imagine there being some shelves to store all the information that's coming in. People who have a higher working memory capacity have more shelf space to store more information there at once. And people with a more efficient working memory, they'll be able to direct their attention to the right pieces of information to take in, not to clutter these shelves with irrelevant things to what you want to learn. And this is also where old pieces of information that you already have stored in your long-term memory are brought up to connect to the new information that came in. So with more connections to the existing knowledge, the new information can then be transitioned more smoothly into our long-term memory as well. So this is why working memory is such an important cognitive function when it comes to learning new things, because it basically just determines how much information we can efficiently process and form connections with.
Cool. Yeah, I think personally for me, this is definitely from the moment that our game is live, this is going to be the number one thing that I'm going to be focused on when hiring new colleagues. I think, at the end of the day, we're learning every day. Well, I'm still learning a lot every day. It really makes sense. Hey, how would you, so learning ability is important. We also know why. It might feel like a slightly biased question considering what we do as a company, but I still want to ask you the question. How can you then assess a candidate's learning ability in a job application procedure?
Well, I think traditionally what people have been doing, especially with CVs, is looking at indicators of how well someone would have been able to learn. So, I mean, usually, people have to learn things in school. They have to learn things when they go to university. So very often, I think hiring managers or recruiters tend to use that information to make an assumption about how well someone learns, like how well they did in school or how well they did in university. But when you have a lot of applicants with a lot of different backgrounds that have done different trainings, different courses, and may have had various reasons of why or why not they did well in a certain course or training, it becomes very difficult to objectively compare them on the same criteria. So it very often isn't actually that indicative of how well someone learns, how well they did in university or in high school. I think focusing on the underlying mechanism behind your learning ability, which in this case would be working memory to a large extent, just creates a bit more of a fair way to assess how well someone is able to do this without all the other interfering factors, and to be able to just assess everyone on the same standards.
Yeah, check. I think that's it's a well-known thing. We draw a lot of conclusions from the resume, and we take what's on a resume as a proxy for, hey, probably then you're smart. I think it was interesting. We also did that research a couple of months ago, right, where we looked into one of our cognitive games and whether we saw a link between the score on that game and your highest educational level, and it actually turned out, well, I think it's not that surprising after what you just said, but that your highest educational level is definitely not a proxy for your cognitive level or how smart you are.
I think it's problem-solving ability. And yeah, we have, I think, quite a big group now also for people who hold a PhD, and this is not the group that performs the best. So,
well, then a good thing that I didn't finish my master's degree in that case. Hey, I see 2 questions in the chat. I wanted to touch upon one last topic before we are going to cover the question in the chat. I do think, by the way, that for everyone who had it in their calendar, this webinar was there for 45 minutes, but I think 30 minutes will do the trick. But one last topic that I wanted to touch upon with you is, so I speak with a lot of companies on a weekly basis. It can be both customers, but it can also be companies that are interested in buying Equalture. And something that I hear a lot, not only for learning ability, more for general cognitive tests, but specifically learning ability, is that they oftentimes say, like, yeah, for junior roles, I get it, because there's not so much to look at on a resume, and so I do get the importance of assessing learning ability for a junior candidate. But once the candidate gets more senior, I don't know why I should be doing that. What is your view on that?
Well, I think it really depends on the role, but I don't think that you should make a distinction between senior or junior roles there, because generally any change tends to require learning. So any change in responsibilities or maybe technologies that you're working with will require learning. Changes in the market that your company is situated in is gonna create new problems and require new solutions and learning about them. So I think overall, there are a lot of roles where you need to learn new skills, either to advance or just to keep up, basically, with changes in new innovations, technologies. And I mean, we see it, right? That a lot of the jobs that are going to be relevant in a couple of years don't even exist yet. And well, they're not all going to be junior roles. So
yeah, no, definitely. I always use the example, like I've seen a lot of when we, for example, developed our platform, we started off with the freelance engineering team, and then we started building our own team, and our freelance engineers were very experienced on paper, and we hired a couple of junior engineers afterwards to join our team, and I saw that the very senior ones with the very impressive resume actually took much longer to get some sort of up and running. And the junior ones actually were up and running super fast. And well, back then we didn't have a game to measure learning ability, but my assumption would be that that definitely has something to, that's definitely something to take into account. Having that said, I see some questions in the chat. Sorry, I'm horrible at multitasking. Also one of the cognitive functions. Definitely not my best score. But I see a question from Marie coming in. How would a hiring manager figure out what level of cognitive ability or learning ability is needed for the job? Well, I think that's a discussion that we have a lot internally here. Would you like to take that one, or would you like me to answer this one?
Well, I think in general, I would try to probably look at which kind of cognitive abilities might be more or less relevant. Because I mean, you can look at cognition in general, but there's very different parts of cognition, and different complex roles may require high performance in some cognitive abilities and not in others. So I think, for example, there's things like problem-solving ability, there are things like cognitive flexibility, working memory. These all may be more or less required in different roles. So I think generally it already helps to split up what part of cognition you're most interested in for a specific role, instead of just saying, I want everything that has to do with cognition to be high. So
yeah, that's a very conscious decision we also made in our product. We had a lot of discussions around this, of course. Like, a lot of assessment tools give one score on cognition, where we say, okay, we have separate scores for every part, because not every part is indeed that relevant. So that really makes sense. And Marie, to give you an example, what we do in our platform, we have we call it the hiring criteria identification survey. It's designed by Leonie's team, by the way, that asks you some very specific questions on the role to basically help you find out, hey, is this actually relevant? And to what extent is it relevant? So should people score average or maybe a little bit above average? However, that still relies on your own input, of course. Something that you could also do is, but there's a big disclaimer there that we also always mention to our customers. What some of our customers do is they use assessments to assess their top performers in the company. Then you should make sure that the group is big enough, and you should also make sure that you measure performance in a very objective way in your organization. Otherwise, your top performance group is just a subjective group of people that you like. And you could, for example, let them also go through the assessment and then see, hey, what is the level that we see as a performance on that game? And maybe it turns out that the level is actually a bit lower than expected, which also means that you don't only have to hire the best of the best candidates on this specific game. So I hope that clarifies your question. I see another question coming in, Caroline. How important are the circumstances to optimize learning ability? I'm not sure what circumstances in this context could be. That could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. But Leonie, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I can think of maybe if you are hiring someone who is required to learn a couple of new things, but is not that high on learning ability or on working memory, there are probably ways of setting the circumstances for this person to make it a bit easier, and to break things down a bit more, and to, be aware that, low learning ability or low working memory doesn't mean someone is unable to learn something new. Just means they might take a little bit more time and a little bit more effort for this. So then I would say, as the hiring manager, when you're aware of this, it already helps to just know that this person might need a little bit more time or a little bit of extra help with some of the learning parts of their job.
Yeah, check. And Caroline, if you have any additions to your question, or if we interpreted it the wrong way, then feel free to just pop the question in the chat again. I see a question from Gita. I hope that I pronounced your name correctly, by the way. I'm also not sure if I understand that question correctly. What do you think about unlearn ability? Gita, I would like to ask you to maybe rephrase it a little bit so that we know what you exactly mean, and then I will make sure to get back to your question so that we don't give you an answer to the wrong question. First to Rachel. Rachel, you're requesting resources to support construct validity of our assessments. That is something that you can request on our website, and we can maybe Kat can also put it in the chat. So I think that part is covered then. And then there's another question coming in. How do you convince or assist the hiring manager to look at the candidate's estimated knowledge and abilities versus their education? Well, I think to maybe to answer this one for you, I would say the research that we showed at the beginning of the webinar. So there was, let's go back to the slide, this one. what we always do when we start working with a new customer is we always provide the hiring manager with a training. And in this training, this is a big part of what we discuss, because I think a lot of hiring managers, it's not that they're unwilling to change their habits, but I think drawing conclusions from education and work experience is such a deep-rooted habit that it's also difficult to let go of that. I think science is in that case always the best way to convince hiring managers, just to show them, hey, based on research, it is not a valid predictor of job performance compared to different methods. So that would definitely be my my tip. I think objective research is always the best way to convince people. I don't know, Leonie, if you would like to add something to that, but I think I gave the answer that you were hoping for already.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that might come up into people's minds is, of course, there are jobs where a certain education is required. Like, you're not going to hire a doctor who hasn't studied medicine. There are a couple of jobs where you will need this as a baseline requirement, that they know what they're doing. But first of all, this doesn't have to be your only criteria. As in, whether or not someone has studied medicine, you might have multiple applicants that have studied medicine if you're looking for a doctor, or anything where you think education is still very relevant. Then you can still add additional information like their cognitive abilities to then distinguish between the candidates that have the education that you have as a prerequisite. But for a lot of different types of jobs in companies, I mean, we see it a lot in our company. I don't even know what most of the people studied that we work with. I think it's not usually what they're now doing for work. And that doesn't mean that they're doing a bad job at all. So,
yeah, definitely. I see one more question coming in. I don't know, Asta, if you're referring to our assessment specifically or more in general, but Leonie, the question is, what are the metrics used to evaluate an individual's learning ability?
Well, very often in companies, people tend to estimate it based on the outcome of some training and how successful someone was in completing a certain training. In our assessment, we're really using the metrics that are used, that are similar to the ones in traditional working memory assessments. So that is something that, yeah, again, we can share our validation reports. There's a bit more information in there about that. But generally, what we try to assess with the game is how much information people can keep in mind and actively work with during our gamified assessment.
Yeah. By the way, I see that our colleague Kat posted the link to our science page on the website. If you scroll down, there's a form where you can request all of our validation studies. So there you can learn more about also specifically this game. Then Gita, thanks for coming back. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so what she meant was, if you want to learn new things, sometimes you also need to unlearn the way you were doing things. So is it also important to have the skills to unlearn something in order to learn something new? That ties more in maybe with breaking habits even.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this is something that I would personally probably relate to cognitive flexibility a bit more.
Yeah.
And which is strongly related also to how easily you can switch mindsets and switch in between different goals in your mind. And I think, yeah, just being flexible enough to not stick to certain habits or a certain routine way of thinking. So I think if this is something that's really important to you, this is something where I would say then look at both working memory and cognitive flexibility. But again, I think this is where it makes sense to split cognitive abilities into the different subcategories, because you might have very different requirements for different job positions, and different questions will require different cognitive abilities.
Yeah, definitely. All right. I don't see any new questions coming in. Let me double check if I don't forget about any of them. No. So I think that is it. And as I mentioned, I see one question I think they're coming in. Are you advocates of divergent thinking?
Well, I think we definitely are. We are big advocates of having different approaches in our teams, different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching problems and tasks. I think we try to get diversity into our teams as much as we can.
Yeah. And what might also be something interesting to share about our own assessments, but it goes a little bit in depth now, well, Leonie, we actually had a very long conversation about it not too long ago, is the fact that, well, we highly value neurodiversity. I think neurodiversity is, I'm very glad that it's a topic that's getting more and more awareness. But we also, for example, made a very conscious decision of not changing norm groups based on, for example, people with autism, ADHD, etc. And the reason why we do so is because probably there are pros and cons of different categories of neurodiversity. But if you are going to sort of normalize those outcomes, then probably everyone is going to end up in the middle. While there are a lot of advantages of, for example, people on the autism spectrum. And of course, this is always some sort of an average. There are always outliers, but we had a very interesting webinar on neurodiversity not too long ago. Olivier, you can find it on our website, by the way, if you're interested in checking that. It was with Ludmilla. She's a professor for university in the US and focused on neurodiversity. And she also explains the advantages of, for example, people on the autism spectrum and how their cognitive abilities could be different from neurodivergent people. So I'm definitely a big advocate for neurodiversity, and I think there should get still much more awareness around this topic so that we can educate ourselves a bit more on that. All right, having that said, I don't see any new questions coming in, so I would really like to thank everyone for joining today, and special thanks to you, Leonie, for joining. We do also have an article on our website. I think Kat shared it already, or maybe then she's going to do it, that one of Leonie's colleagues, Jay, wrote on learning ability. It's a bit more of a deep dive, so I would definitely check it out if you're interested in learning more about the topic. And big thanks again, Leonie. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me again.
Cool. For everyone who joined today, big thanks again. I hope you learned a lot from it. If you have any questions for, I always say for Leonie or for me, but I think it's probably going to be for Leonie and not for me, then we're both active on LinkedIn. Feel free to add us there and ask any questions that you might have. There's also a link to the community. We recently launched a community. It's called the Breaking Bias Community. It's a platform that you can sign up for. It's free, where we discuss all kinds of topics around unbiased hiring, diversity and inclusion, and everything related to that. So I would definitely recommend you to sign up for the community to join the conversation after this webinar today. Thanks again, and I wish you all a great day. And thanks, Leonie.
Okay, thanks.
Ciao.
Bye.